Paramatmane Namaha. Meditation on all is self, all is Atman. RIbhu Gita, Chapter 10. Meditation on the self is all. RIbhu, hear about the nature of the self, rare to come by in all the world, the highest, the essence of the essence. All this is of the nature of the self, all is of the self. Nothing else exists. All is the self, the supreme self, of the nature of the highest, the self of the nature of eternal bliss. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. Self you are, self I am, and the entire phenomenal universe too is nothing but self. Meditate upon this Mahavakya, the supreme truth of yours. Meditate on this. Do Nidhi-dhyasana. This is a very effective key to self-realization. Nidhi-dhyasana, Vedantic meditation, is key to self-realization. Meditate on this truth. All is Atman alone. The Atman is the self of all. The Atman is the self of all. Meditate on this. Listen to this. Reflect on this. Meditate on this. Practice profound meditation on this truth, in order to become free from all fears of disease, death, and become immortal. All is the self, the supreme self of the nature of the highest, the self of the nature of eternal bliss. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The self is a great and of the nature of fullness. The self is pure. It is of the nature of the eternal. The self is changeless and blemishless. It is of the nature of the selfless. The self is of the nature of the peaceful and the peaceless. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The individual self is the supreme self indeed. The individual self is the supreme self indeed. Meditate on this supreme truth. Meditate on this. It is of the nature of the mind and no mind. It is filled with consciousness. It is the one self. It is the self of a single nature. It is the manifold self. It is without a self. The self is of the nature of the liberated and the unliberated. It is without liberation and non-liberation. The self is of the nature of liberation. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature of the dual and the non-dual, yet it is devoid of duality and non-duality. The self of all is devoid of all. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature of joy and joylessness. The self is of the nature of liberation. The self is of the nature of the divine. The self is of the essence of the sankalpales. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is partless. The self is blemishless. The self is intelligence. The self is of the nature of Purusha. The self is bliss. Certainly, the self is without origin. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is beyond count. The self is multitude also. The self is immortal. The self is the core of immortality. The self is the past, present, and future. Nothing exists besides the self. Meditate upon this. The self is all. The self is independent. The self is respected. The self is of the nature of existence. The self is of the nature of the presence of Turiya, the fourth state. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature that is ever directly present. It is ascertained by its eternal presence. The self is of the nature devoid of anything else. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature devoid of non-existence. It is devoid of anything else, itself being supreme. The self is pure and beyond knowledge and ignorance. It is without proof or absence of proof. Self alone exists. Meditate upon this. Reflect upon this. The self is devoid of permanence and impermanence. It is beyond the fruits of the here or the there, the next world. The self is devoid of the sextet of Shama and others. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is without the desire for liberation also. The Vedas are the self. Dhamma is of the nature of the self. Uparati is ever of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Titiksha is at all times of the nature of the self. Samadhana ever abides in the self. The self is pure. The self abides in itself. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The self is without the Annakosha. It is without the Pranakosha. It is without the Manomaya Kosha. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The self is without the Vijnanamaya Kosha. It is without the Anandamaya Kosha and any other sheath. The self is without the pented of sheaths. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature of Nirvikalpa. The self is devoid of Savikalpa. The self is devoid of compliance with the scriptures. Certainly nothing exists besides the self. The self is without the gross body, the self is without the subtle body, the self is without the causal body or any other body. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is the void which is endowed with seeing. The self is devoid of mixing with the seen. It is without beginning, middle, or end. It is peaceful. The self is without samadhi. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is without the aphorisms of wisdom. It is without aphorisms like Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Aphorisms like Tattvamasi, that you are and others are the self. All Mahavakyas are the self. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is without such aphorisms as I am Atma, this is the self, all is self and others. The syllable Om is the self, the gunas are the self, nothing exists besides the self, nothing exists besides the self. The self is of the nature devoid of the waking state. It is without the state of dreams. The self is of the nature of bliss and is perfectly full. Nothing else exists besides the self. The self is the past. The self is also the future. The self is imperishable. Consciousness is of the nature of the self. The self is of the nature of the beginningless and middleless. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is devoid of all sankalpa. It is just shining consciousness alone. It is undecaying. The self is devoid of the knower and the knowable and such. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is one. The self is devoid of oneness. It is devoid of duality and a concept of non-duality. The self is itself. The self is natural. Nothing exists besides the self. The fourth state is the self. Eternality is the self. Whatever is here in the list is of the nature of the self. The self is the measure. The self is without a measure. Nothing exists besides the self. The self is the limit of the many words. It is the joy that is spoken about. It revels in itself. The self is devoid of everything. The self is indeed all. Nothing exists besides the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Look at the self alone. Consider yourself to be the self. Be in yourself. Experience the self yourself. Nothing exists besides the self. Contemplate on this, meditate on this, and become free from all bondage and ignorance. Being happy only in one's own self, considering oneself as the self indeed, one should perceive oneself as the self, understanding oneself as the self. Contemplate on this, meditate on this supreme truth. Oneself satisfied in one's own self, oneself filled up by one's own self. One should reduce oneself to ashes. reduce oneself in the sense the ego-based identity to ashes. Realizing yourself as the self supreme, reduce the ego-based identity of yours and the phenomenal world to ashes. Dissolve it. The ego-based existence of phenomenal world and ego-based identity of your individuality is dissolved by understanding, contemplating and meditating that all is self alone. You are self, I am self, and the one non-dual supreme self is all that exists, nothing else exists. Enjoying oneself full of love for oneself, one should reflect only on one's self. Nothing exists besides the self. Only the self is to be heard. Let the self be the only thing you hear. The self alone should be desired ever. Ever worship the self alone. Ever worship the self alone. Worship mental, worship physical, worship verbal. Worship self alone, the Atman alone. Because that alone exists, that is Brahman, that is Paramatman. The self alone is the supreme reality. You are self, I am self, and everything and everyone is self of the nature of pure consciousness, vast spacious awareness. Meditate on this. Meditate on this to become free from all bondage and ignorance. The self should ever be praised. Attend to the self always. The self should ever be desired. Nothing else exists besides the self. This earth is only the self. The water is only the self. This light is only the self. Nothing exists besides the self. This air is only the self. This space is only the self. This ego is only the self, in the sense that essence of ego too is only self of the nature of pure consciousness. Nothing exists besides the self. This thought is only the self. This mind is only the self. The intellect is only the self. Nothing exists besides the self. The body, mind, intellect, all are considered as inert because the essence of thoughts, mind, body, intellect, all this is nothing but self. Self of the nature of pure consciousness alone is the essence of even the mind, body, intellect, everything else. The essence of all the senses is nothing but the self. You are self, I am self, all is self. Contemplate on this, meditate on this, and become free from all duality, delusion, and ignorance and bondage. This body is only the self, this guna is only the self, this truth is only the self, nothing exists besides the self. This mantra is only the self, this japa is only the self, this world is only the self, nothing exists besides the self. This sound is only the self, this taste is only the self, this touch is only the self, nothing exists besides the self. Meditate upon this. This smell is only the self, this tranquility is only the self, this sorrow is only the self, this happiness is only the self. All this phenomenal world is only of the self. The dream is only the self. The deep sleep state is also the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Self is essence of all, without exception, because self is all in all. Self alone exists. Meditate upon this. Activity is only the self. Plenitude is only the self. Non-duality is of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Whoever is of the self. Whatever is of the self. This world is of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. All this that is to be seen is only the self. These people are only the self. All this is only the self. Nothing exists besides the self. This God, Shambho, is only the self. This world is movement. This world of movement is only the self. This Brahma is only the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Meditate on this. This sun is only the self. This which is insentient is only the self. This meditation is only the self. This result is only the self. The meditation too is only the self. All acts are self. All objects are self. You are self. I am self. Meditate on this supreme truth. Reflect on this. Meditate on this and become free from all the sorrows and sufferings and fears. You are the self, infinite, eternal, immortal self you are. Contemplate on this and become free. Meditate on this and become liberated. This yoga is only the self. All this world is pervaded by the self. All that exists is of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Consider all as the nature of the self. Consider all as of the nature of the self. The Guru is entirely of the nature of the self. Shishya, the disciple, is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. A God is entirely of the nature of the self. The fruits are entirely of the nature of the self. All goals are of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Reflect on this, contemplate on this, and meditate on this. Holy waters are all of the nature of the self. Oneself is entirely of the nature of the self. Liberation is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Desire is entirely of the nature of the self. Action is entirely of the nature of the self. Anger is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Knowledge is entirely of the nature of the self. The directions are entirely of the nature of the self. Covetousness is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Contemplate on this, meditate on this, and become free. Right now, right here. Infatuation is entirely of the nature of the self. Fear is entirely of the nature of the self. Thinking is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Meditate on this. Courage is entirely of the nature of the self. Determination is entirely of the nature of the self. Truth is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Knowledge is entirely of the nature of the self. Steadfastness is entirely of the nature of the self. The measurable is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Meditate on this, reflect on this. The mysterious is entirely of the nature of the self. The auspicious is entirely of the nature of the self. The pure is entirely of the nature of the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Contemplate on this, meditate on this to become self-realized, because self-realization alone brings the supreme blissful state of yours within your realm. Only self-realization leads to this complete cessation of all sorrows, sufferings and fears, and attainment of unbroken infinite bliss to you. Therefore, contemplate on this truth, meditate on this, and become free from all sorrows, sufferings, and bondage and ignorance. All is entirely of the nature of the self. The self is truth. The truth is the self, ever of the self. Fullness is the self. Decay is also the self. The highest is the self. It is higher than the highest. Hence is also the self. Thence is also the self. From then on is also the self. Only the self. Truly all is pervaded by the self. Nothing exists besides the self. Everything and everyone is essentially pervaded and permeated by nothing but self. Self of the nature of pure consciousness, vast spacious awareness, pure intelligence. That alone exists, nothing else exists. Contemplate on this, meditate on this, and become free right now, right here. All is of the nature of the self alone. All is of the nature of the self alone. All is of the nature of the self alone. Contemplate on this, meditate on this, and become the self. Become the self in the sense that dissolve the duality and the sense of all duality and the ego-based identity, individuality, and become one indivisible, non-dual self, self-eternal, self-immortal, self-infinite, self-omnipotent, self-omnipresent, self-omniscient. Become the self, the Supreme Paramatman. Become the self, Supreme Brahman. You are self, I am self, all is self, and self is one. The same Supreme Self appears as the self of all objects of the phenomenal world of duality. In reality, there is one indivisible, non-dual self alone. Reflect on this, meditate on this, and become free right now, right here. All is of the nature of the self alone, the seen and the unseen, the moving and the unmoving, understanding that all is the self. Man attains liberation, man attains moksha. You attain too by knowing that all is self alone. Nothing else exists but self alone exists. You are self supreme. He only, Bhagavan the Lord, the consort of Uma, changeless, with his own power, with his own Maya, is the efficient cause of this wondrous waking world of bodies and succession of activities, and because he is the self. So, contemplate on this, meditate on this and become free, that there is nothing else other than the self. One self is the self of all. You are the self. I am the self. Meditate on this and become free. Chidanandaropaha Shivoham Shivoham Ayamatma Brahma. This self is Brahman. This self is Brahman. This self is Brahman. That Brahman you are. That Brahman I am. Reflect on this, contemplate on this, and meditate on this in order for self-realization, enlightenment, and supreme liberation. Chidanandaropaha Shivoham Shivoham